Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Sulpizio, and I'm here to host the virtual outing for today. We are pleased to have Kevin Schindler, who's a GCHS board member. He's an astronomer, an author, and an historian, present Brighty of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon Historical Society has a mission statement to celebrate and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's historic, cultural, and historic and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. We celebrated 40 years in 2024, and there's a really good article in the summer issue of the Old Pioneer magazine about the history and the formation of the society. Um, this is an all-volunteer organization. Please become a member. The dues are only $35 per year. And join us so we can continue to expand our many activities like these virtual outings. There's the website link. It's very easy to find with a quick search. And if you would prefer to have a direct contact with the membership, you have membership at grandcanyonhistory.org. And so I'll leave it at that. The benefits of membership is you receive the Old Pioneer magazine with its companion, the Bulletin, on a contemporary basis. There are 4 issues per year. Also, for your summer reading, please consider purchasing the recently published 6 proceedings of the 2023 Grand Canyon History Symposium. It's available at the GCC online or at their South Rim bookstore. But tonight, we have Brighty of the Grand Canyon. And Kevin, as I mentioned, is a historian and public information officer at Lowell Observatory, where he's worked for 30 years. He's a member of the board. He's a board member of the Grand Canyon Historical Society and has authored 8 books, including Past and Present Grand Canyon.
It's just an honor for me to be able to be here and talk about one of so many stories about the Grand Canyon. You know, when we think about the canyon, we all have probably, I don't know if we have a favorite story or if we have at least a handful of them, because there are so many different things, from the geology to the people to the animals. There's so many, the river, there's so many different aspects of the canyon that draw us in. For me, I like all those. But this one in particular, Brighty of the Grand Canyon, really captured my attention years ago because I'm a history guy. But I also like movies and I like to read. I read a lot. And the Brighty story captures all that stuff. It captures old movies and books. There's drama. There's kind of whodunit involved with some of the story. It's got the makings of a great novel, but it's real. Although a novel is involved, but the story, there's the real story of Brighty. There's the novel that really popularized who Brighty was, and then there's a movie that probably not as many people know about. I would say that the book is probably the most well-known, and then maybe the movie or maybe the real story. But what I want to do is combine them all and kind of look how one played into the other, because it's really kind of an interesting story. So let me share my screen here. And again, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And I see my old friend Kathy Ferretta, who was on the Grand Canyon Historical Society board years ago, and a great historian Flagstaff, and so many others have joined us. So let's talk a little bit about Brighty. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the actual story, because Brighty was a real burro or donkey that lived in the Grand Canyon, and then how Brighty's story was popularized, how that led to the novelized version of the story, which I think Marguerite Henry, who wrote the novel, did really well in capturing the spirit of Brighty and keeping the story in a positive light. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And then the movie, which I don't know how many people have seen the movie, but usually when I talk to folks in person, not many realize there's a movie made, even though there are some major actors and director and such involved. So where does Brighty start? Well, if we go back to the 1880s, 1889 in specific, this is just a few years after John Wesley Powell and his crew first went down the Colorado River a couple times in the 1870s, 1869, and a couple years later. 1889, there was a group of railroad operators. One of them was Frank Brown, president of the company, and they wanted to go down the Colorado River because they had this idea of running a railroad through where the Colorado ran. And today, for those who have been down there, especially, it sounds kind of funny to think about having a railroad down there. The engineering it would have taken to do that is stunning. But they had this idea um, to do a railroad, and so they started an expedition, but it didn't turn out very well. You can see this stone has this scratched in. F.M. Brown was drowned July 10th, 1889. So here's where roughly that happened. Brown's Riffle is named after him down the river. You kind of get an idea if you're familiar with where Lee's Ferry is in Marble Canyon. They hadn't gone down the river that far before this happened. And Frank Brown was the boat tipped and he was carried down the river. The expedition was canceled. They tried again a couple years later successfully to go down. But Brown's wife, when she got word of this, she thought, I'm not giving up. They said he was lost in the river, but she held out hope that maybe he could still be found in some capacity, maybe even if his body was found, but just to have closure. And so she hired this fella who lived at the North Rim, and he and a partner, she hired them to go down and look for her husband. And the only way they could access the river was by Bright Angel Creek, going down from the North Rim to Bright Angel Creek. So we're talking about dozens of miles below where the accident happened. So the likelihood of finding anything was really remote. They could hike up the river a bit and down and look for signs. Very unlikely, but she was determined to find her husband in whatever capacity he remained. So she hired them. And so they went down the very rough trail that went down from the North Rim, and they got to Bright Angel Creek. And this is Bright Angel Creek down by Phantom Ranch. And this is about a mile or so from the Colorado River. So they arrived here and they were surprised. Whoops, I'll get to that in a second. They were surprised to find a couple things here. I mean, they didn't expect to see anybody down here, which they didn't in terms of humans, but they saw somebody else. Now, I like history. I like all the quirky little things in history. So one of my favorite things is, like Bright Angel Creek. Where'd the name come from? And we have a lot of Grand Canyon experts on here who know this, but I like to share it anyways. For those of you who might have grown up in a church where you sang hymns, there's a song, Shall we gather at the river where bright angel feet have trod. I won't put you through any more than that, but you see that first line, where bright angel feet have trod. That's the namesake of the Bright Angel Creek. That was John Wesley Powell's attempt to kind of balance out another name he had used earlier in the expedition that had the devil's name in it. So he thought, well, he'll make it a little bit more heavenly and use Bright Angel. So that's where Bright Angel Creek comes from, and the Bright Angel, the rocks and everything Bright Angel starts with the song. So this guy, the guy who's going to try to find Frank Brown or his remains or whatever, he and his partner get down to the creek, and they're surprised to see a tent there. And nobody's in the tent, but there was a donkey there, just kind of hanging out. And so they saw this tent and the donkey, and then they went down to the Colorado River, and they spent several days going up and down the river. Never found Frank Brown or any evidence of him. So they decided to come back, and they got back to the tent and they looked a little closer and found that somebody had been there somewhat recently, maybe a week or 2 weeks before. There was a Dutch oven with some food still in it with the lid on, and there was a receipt from Babbitt Brothers in Flagstaff. So So these guys surmised that maybe these guys were down here mining, perhaps. They had gone up for supplies. Maybe they had done that repeatedly, but maybe they crossed the river and drowned themselves. Um, they never did find anybody, but they got back to the tent, and here's this donkey there again, just kind of hanging out. And so that could have been the end of that story. They went back to the widow and, sorry, we didn't find any remains of Frank or his living body. Um, but they kind of told the story about this donkey that was unusual because it was just hanging out down there. Well, as time went on, and people familiar with the canyon would hike up and down, they realized that this donkey was pretty easy to identify, and they realized that it was a pretty regular sight. In the summertime, it would between the seasons it would go up or down the canyon. In the summertime, it would go up the trail, as it were, and sometimes hang out at Jimmy Owens, who is a game warden who famous for killing a lot of cougars. In the summertime, when it got really hot, or in the wintertime when it got really cold, top and snowy, he would head down where it was warmer. And so Brighty became this fixture, first seen by these guys looking for Frank Brown's body. And then as time went on, people realized, hey, this is the same donkey. And he certainly wasn't the only donkey that was here, because miners early on, some of the first people or some of the first Europeans to go to the Grand Canyon, they went there for mining and they brought donkeys, and quite often they either let them loose or they escaped. And so donkeys kind of proliferated throughout the Grand Canyon. So this wasn't the only donkey, but became very well known and just kind of seasonally go up in one season, come back down to the river in the next season. In 1913, Theodore Roosevelt and his son and cousin and some others hiked into the canyon, and there's a story that they saw Brighty. There's no evidence of this. Some experts have looked at this classic picture of Theodore Roosevelt and looked at the critters in here, and none of them, based on experts comparing these to known pictures of Brighty, can confirm that one of these was Brighty. Later on in the book that Marguerite Henry wrote, she wrote about Roosevelt being there at the opening of a bridge, and Brighty was there, and Roosevelt let Brighty be the first one to cross the bridge. And that was kind of a mix of history. Roosevelt was down there, but he was not there for the opening of any bridge. That was after his time down there. But that's kind of the novelization of the whole thing. So people that are familiar with the canyon know about this donkey, and they called him. Who knows who the first person to call him Brighty was, but that's what he became known as. But then the story became more well known. In 1917, the McKees, and this is no relation to Eddie McKee, who is a naturalist at the Grand Canyon for decades, a little bit later in time. But Thomas McKee and his wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of Mr. Wiley, and Wiley had started these kind of the first tourist camps in national parks in the West, Wiley camps. And he wanted to put one up at the Grand Canyon, so he asked his daughter and son-in-law to open it. So the McKees opened this in 1917 as the Northern's first tourist facility. And it's right where, Bright Angel Point and the lodge at North Rim, right in that area. That's where they had this camp. So they opened this, and it didn't take long for them to get to know this burro, this donkey, Brighty. And Brighty was really friendly. This is some of the McKee family with Brighty, and Brighty would come into the camp and be friendly with people. But boy, don't ask Brighty to do any work, especially if any adults tried to put Brighty to work, like to carry stuff. Didn't happen. Brighty would be a donkey and refuse to do it. But one person figured out how to get him to do stuff, and that was the McKee boy. And he realized that his job every day was to go down about a half mile down below the rim and to gather water in these tanks. And that was a lot of weight for a young kid, 7, 8 years old. But he realized that he could make Brighty do this, where adults had no sway with Brighty. The young McKee boy did, because he realized that Brighty loved pancakes. And so young McKee would say, Brighty, come and get your pancakes. And by that time he had had enough to where if he heard the name pancakes, the word pancakes, he would come running. So he would come running. Young McKee would put the tanks on him, on Brighty, take him down, get the water, fill him up. And when they got back, take the tanks off, and then Brighty would just get his pancakes. So that was a surefire way to get Brighty to do anything, but nobody else figured that out. And so Brighty had a weak spot. So this went on, and Brighty became a fixture. This is the first tourist camp. And what did tourists see? They saw the splendor of the Grand Canyon. They could hike down and see the water, the great vistas, and the characters. Uncle Jimmy Owens, sometimes they would meet, and this donkey Brighty. And so Brighty became part of the tourist experience, and became such a big part of it that Thomas McKee in 1922 decided to write an article for Sunset Magazine, introduced Brighty, free citizen, how the sagacious hermit donkey of the Grand Canyon maintained his liberty for 30 years. So going back to the 1890s, there's been a known presence in Brighty. And the end of the story, this is the end of the story as it was originally written. Brighty is now about 36 years old, and to all appearances is as hale and hearty as ever. Unless some accident befalls him, he has many happy years in store. Well, sadly, while this was going to press, an accident of sorts did befall him, and the editors were able to make an adjustment to the story in time. And it's a sad story, and I hate to bring it up because it feels like, what a depressing thing. That's the end of the story, but it's not. But the editors added this note at the last minute. Just as this sketch was going to press, came word that Brighty is no more. He was killed and eaten by 2 men lost in the maze of the Bath Canyon. For the week before they were rescued, they subsisted entirely on burro meat, so that Brighty's tragic end prevented a greater tragedy. Now, Tom said this was a family program, and holy cow, this sounds pretty sad. This almost sounds like a Disney story where, like, Snow White or whatever, where the mother deer is killed. But this does have a happy ending, so don't leave yet. But that's sad. What had happened is there's a criminal who was down in the canyon, and he was trying to get up before winter hit, but he didn't make it. And he ended up staying at a cabin down in the middle of the canyon. And lo and behold, there's also this sort of athletic guy that was also trying to get up the canyon. He also got stuck in winter. They ended up at the same cabin. And you can imagine these two guys that didn't trust each other, 1 foot on the floor at all time, 1 eye open at night, and they ran out of food. Brighty was with the criminal guy, and eventually they decided they're either going to starve or they have a meal in front of them, many meals. They ended up killing Brighty. But the story, we all live, we all die. Brighty's end was not the way we want to go, but Brighty's legacy is certainly a happy one, because it turns out that, the article, and let me go back here, this article in Sunset Magazine, a magazine that several people subscribe to, but, not New York Times, not everybody saw the story. But if we jump ahead a little bit to 1953, there is this young lady in Elgin, Illinois, and she had written some books, and she was working on another book. She had written books about horses, and she was interested in writing other books about horses and animals related to horses, like mules and donkeys. And so she went to the public library in Elgin, and she asked the librarian, what do you have information about donkeys and mules and such? And the librarian said, oh, turns out I remember seeing this article in Sunset Magazine by this guy, Thomas McKee, and this might be of interest to you. Well, this young lady was enthralled by this story. Her name was Marguerite Henry, and you might be familiar with Misty of Chincoteague and other books she wrote. But she just was enthralled by the story, and she kind of changed course. She was doing research for a book that had donkeys kind of as a background story, but she decided she's going to write a book about this donkey Brighty because the story was just so great. How Brighty had inspired so many people that had visited the Grand Canyon, and so Marguerite Henry decides she's going to write her next book about donkeys. And Marguerite Henry is kind of like if you read James Michener in later years, who was sort of an immersive writer. He would live somewhere like Spain or Hawaii or Virginia or wherever, and he would live there for a couple of years, completely immerse himself in the culture and history, read all he could, and then incorporate that into a story. Marguerite Henry is kind of like that. She decided to buy her own donkey because she wanted to be able to look and be able to describe it accurately and watch how it behaved and how it interacted with humans. So she ended up acquiring a donkey named Jiggs, Jiggs the donkey, which she renamed later to Brighty. And she travels to the Grand Canyon, and she hiked down some of the same trails that Thomas McKee talked about, some of the same trails that Theodore Roosevelt had hiked. She went to Cliff Springs Trail, and she camped out overnight. And the rangers told her, "You're out of your mind if you do this by yourself because mountain lions are known to go through here." But she wanted the true experience, just as Brighty would have had, just as Theodore Roosevelt, which she was incorporating into the book, had. She went there, and in the middle of the night, she described later she heard the growling and realized there was, in fact, probably a mountain lion outside of her tent. She just got inside her sleeping bag, held it down, and survived the night. But that was part of the experience, her experience that she could incorporate in the book. So she had, the story by Thomas McKee, which was really just, a couple pages, but by going to the Grand Canyon, immersing herself in the story, she really got to embrace it a lot better. Here she is with Jiggs, and she also had a horse named Misty, because when she wrote the book Misty of Chincoteague, she bought just so she could again get to know its personality. And that's what made her story so real and made people connect with them so well, because she described them so accurately because she had the real thing right in front of her. So here she is with her two of her pets, as it were. So she writes this book. It comes out in 1953, and it became very popular, and it stayed popular through the years. If you go to the Grand Canyon today, you can get a modern edition of this. They sell it like in the Bright Angel Lodge at the store there and other places. You can also, if you go there, you can buy you can get your own donkey. That I don't think this one is technically called Brighty, but you can get these. You can get all sorts of Brighty stuff there. So this became a really popular part of the Grand Canyon lore. We have, like I said, we have the geology, the human history that goes back before the Europeans, the indigenous people who lived there. There's modern history. One of my favorite modern things is Apollo astronauts training in the Grand Canyon in preparation to go to the moon. The animal history there with the squirrels and the sheep and so many other animals. This was an animal that was introduced but it was still part of the lore of the Grand Canyon. People read about Brighty and they would go to the Grand Canyon expecting to see Brighty. And they may not have seen Brighty, but they could sure see a lot of other donkeys because the donkeys were overrunning the Grand Canyon. So this book became another angle, another perspective of getting to know the Grand Canyon. And I love how I ended it, because she didn't end it by saying, couple of guys ate Brighty, and that was the end of the story. What a sad ending that would have been, especially for a kid's book. And so, if you bear with me, this is the end of the story, which I think she captures so well. Of course, everyone knows that Brighty has long since left the earth, like we all do. But some animals, like some men, leave a trail of glory behind them. They give their spirit to the place where they lived, and remain forever a part of the rocks and streams and wind and sky. Especially on moonlit nights, a shaggy little form can be seen along the ledges, a thin swirl of dust rising behind him. Some say it's nothing but moonbeams caught up in a cloud, but the older guides swear it's trail dust out of the past, kicked up by Brighty himself, the roving spirit of the Grand Canyon, forever wild, forever free. What a better ending than the real story ending of Brighty. And so this story has been perpetuated through the years. Well, it's funny how history repeats itself, because in 1963 there is this housewife. Her name was Betty Booth. Her husband did some writing, did some directing on TV, did a lot of different things. Well, they had a couple of kids, and so she went into a local bookstore in Detroit, trying to find something to read the kids. They like to sit around the table at night, read stories to the kids. So she went to the bookstore, much as Marguerite Henry went to the library a decade earlier. Betty Booth went looking for something, in this case for her kids. And the librarian said, "Oh, there's this great book by Marguerite Henry." Took it home. Betty Booth and her husband loved it. And her husband was so enthralled by it that he decided he wanted to make a movie about it. So he talked to an old friend of his named Norman Foster. And Norman Foster maybe isn't a name that we know that is familiar with a lot of us today, but you might recognize some of the work he did. There are a series of Mr. Moto movies. Charlie Chan went through a series of different actors through the years, but he directed several Charlie Chan, and probably most famous was a Walt Disney movie, Davy Crockett. And so he was brought on to be the director, and they really got some named people to be in this. For those who like old movies, Joseph Cotten, you're probably familiar with him. He's maybe most well known for being Citizen Kane. That's him on the left with Orson Welles, Joseph Cotten here. One of my favorite sort of quasi film noir movies is Niagara, with Marilyn Monroe, and just a great story if you've never watched that. So this was a well-known actor, maybe a little bit past his prime, but still a real player in Hollywood. The old timer in there, that was kind of based on a real character, sort of. They brought in Dick Foran, and Dick Foran, again, if you know old movies, you might recognize him for some westerns. I remember him most from the first Mummy sequel. There was the original Mummy, it was Karloff, and then they started doing several sequels. And the first one was The Mummy's Hand. And here's Dick Foran being strangled by the mummy. And so that's where you might recognize his face. So the Brighty is to be the old timer, and he's the guy that the criminal Jake Irons, who is based on the real criminal, is that guy kills old timer. And this is, and well, the book follows the true story. The movie really follows the book. This is young Homer Hobbs, and his name was Dandy Curran. I don't know. I never heard of him before doing this research, and he didn't do a lot in Hollywood, but he certainly came from pedigree, because his father played for the Green Bay Packers football team, and his mother was Miss America in 1949. And so through their connections, when word got out that the movie was being made, young Andy was made as he got the part of Homer Hobbs. Again, kind of based on a Marguerite Henry story, sort of. So they make this movie, and oh yeah, who's the main character of the movie is Brighty, So the movie makers tried to bring in different donkeys. And, donkeys are known for their temperament, and none of them really responded well to the rigors of doing a movie. And so Marguerite Henry said, I have Jigs, um, and Jigs is pretty well behaved as donkeys go. So they brought Jigs out from the East Coast, and Jigs ended up playing the part of Brighty. And they even airlifted Jigs down into the canyon. This must have been a great sight to see, to film some scenes um, like were depicted in the book. Like here, here's a picture of Jigs at the springs here, where they airlifted him down. They had a helicopter so much stuff in, more than 1,000 trips they made with supplies and actors and jigs and other things. They kind of the base of operations was Bright Angel Lodge, but down in the canyon they stayed at Phantom Ranch and places in between. So this was quite a production in the 1960s, and I think again for me, an interesting story. One more story for the Grand Canyon, one of so many stories that there's this real burro that captured the imagination of people. There's this best-selling book, and now there's this movie where the movie alone is fascinating because what it took to film down there. Really, there haven't been a lot of movies made in the Grand Canyon for a lot of reasons. Um, and certainly getting down there to film it's not an easy chore, but they're able to make it happen. So Brighty of the Grand Canyon is released in 1966. I don't know. I think before I got to Arizona, I've been here 30 years now. I had heard of the book, Marguerite Henry's book, but I didn't realize there was a movie, not really till a few years ago. But if you get a chance, you can still get it. I have it both on VHS and I ordered a DVD a few years ago, so you can still track it down. I think the Flagstaff Library still has a copy. I think it's been a couple of years since I've checked. So you can track it down. Um, I don't know. I think as movies go, it's not a great movie, but it sure is cool to see some of these scenes that you look and say, that's not a stage, that's the real Grand Canyon. Um, so, anyways, the movie came out, and the end of the movie really paralleled Marguerite Henry's ending. It didn't parallel the true story. It ends very similar to the book. Brighty has long since left this earth, but some animals, like some men, leave. Um, the words are cut off on my screen. I don't remember what that word is, but leave the glory behind them. They give their spirit the place where they have lived, the part of the rocks and streams, the wind and the sky. Brighty's spirit lives on, forever wild, forever free, just like Marguerite Henry's ending. So what a great story, kind of a feel good story at the end. Um, and so the movie comes out, and the director decides to have a statue built, a statue made to help promote the movie, so that you can see the size of the statue. They made some little desktop statues also based on this, but they had this and paraded it around the country, part of the promotion for the movie. If this had been a Walt Disney movie, we all probably would have grown up with it as kids, but it was not a Walt Disney movie, and so it didn't get a lot of fanfare. So this statue helped. Well, after the movie, after a year or so, when the movie was out of the theaters and they were done promoting it, it was donated to Grand Canyon National Park, and it went on display at the South Rim, and it was put on. If you're familiar with where the park headquarters is today, that was the visitor center for years. There's a little court. If you go through the building outside, there's this outdoor court that has space there. And this is where the statue sat for years. And I know Kathy Ferretta, you might recognize this young lady. For those of you who have been in Flagstaff and been to Reard Mansion, you might know Benjamin or Shannon Benjamin. This is young Shannon Benjamin here, and with her mom, when they took this picture years ago when Shannon was just little. So many people learned about Brighty through Marguerite Henry's book and then the movie. And then probably more people even learned about Brighty by going to the canyon and seeing this statue and sitting on it and getting their picture just like young Shannon. And you go to different museums with statues, or you go to statues outside, and they're always like the noses or the pointy parts are always shiny because everybody rubs them. And so this became the tradition with Brighty. You go to the Grand Canyon, you rub Brighty's nose for good luck. And so Brighty, the statue, became beloved. And while the kids may not have known the entire story of Brighty, they went there, and seeing the statue and rubbing its nose and maybe reading in the book was just such a lovely experience. And again, part of the lore of the Grand Canyon. If but the story ended there, it would be a great story. But Brighty, even in, I don't know, the legacy of Brighty really had more impact than all this feel good stuff. And it has to do with the real life donkeys, because those people in the early years, the miners and such, and for those of you who know Robert Lazan, he's a member of the Grand Canyon Historical Society board and just does phenomenal work with the board. He's got a lot of ancestors that were in the Grand Canyon, the Bass family, the Lazan family. And he sent me an email just this morning saying that, his ancestors were kind of responsible for a lot of this, because his one ancestor, Bass, who many of you are familiar with that name, is one of the first miners to kind of bring the donkeys into the canyon and let them loose. And then another ancestor in the Lazan family is one who helped airlift the donkeys out of here. Why were they airlifting donkeys out of the Grand Canyon? Well, for years, those donkeys left by the Basses and others, they became feral animals. They infiltrated the Grand Canyon. There are all these feral trails. There was concern, as we learned about ecology, there was an idea that the donkeys were eating all the food, the plants and such that the native bighorn sheep, for instance, would eat, and the deer. And so there was a policy the Park Service had: let's get rid of these donkeys. They're not native to here. They're eating the livelihood, of the deer and so on. And so they started just shooting them. And by today's standards, that sounds a little extreme, but I don't think we can really judge, because that was years ago and we didn't know as much as we do today about ecology and the best practices and such. But they started shooting them. And the word got out that this was happening. And these people weren't shooting feral donkeys that were creating havoc in the canyon. They were shooting Brighty. Kids who rubbed Brighty's nose and read about Brighty in the book, they were shooting Brighty. How dare they? And so the press that the Park Service got was getting pretty bad. And so in 1978, they removed the statue because so that not as many kids could rub the nose and learn about Brighty. Then hear that Brighty was being shot in the canyon, poor Brighty. So the Park Service removed the statue, which had an even bigger negative impact. Now they made Brighty disappear. Where's Brighty? Poor Park Service, because of course they're trying to do the right thing, and it just wasn't working out. And so this led to there's this airlifting, which was called a donkey Dunkirk. And this is a picture. Maybe this is one of the Lazan family involved here, but they spent a lot of money airlifting the donkeys out and relocating them, because shooting them was getting such bad press. And also, I think, realizing maybe, killing animals isn't the best way. It's not natural. Maybe if natural predators got them, but so anyways, they relocated all of the Brightys, so the Brighty wasn't being shot anymore. Poor kids didn't have to hear about that. And so today there are still some feral donkeys in the Grand Canyon, but it's nothing like at other places and nothing like it was at the Grand Canyon. It's not really a major problem today. So it's not quite the end of the story, though. Many of you might be familiar with these two lovely people, Rose Hauk on the right, and her husband, Michael Collier, on the left, both who have really long legacy with the Grand Canyon. Well, I was talking to them a couple of years ago, and they were telling me about the statue because that statue was put in a closet for years, um, to try to minimize the impact that people were feeling that poor Brighty was being shot. Um, so put in the closet for years. Well, Rose was working at the canyon, and the people she was working with there said, we want to relocate that statue to the north, but we want to do it kind of quietly. So, so Rose and Michael said, we'll do it. So they got the statue in the back of the car, and I don't think it was completely under the cover of night, but they drove um, the statue up to the North Rim, and Brighty was then put on display in the lodge, and that's where Brighty, the statue, is still today. And there's a great display behind it, talking about the real story of Brighty, the book, and so on. And so it really continues to be just like the real life Brighty a century ago, being part of the charismatic or charisma of the Grand Canyon. It's now part of that even more today because of the real Brighty, because of the book, because of the movie, because of the statue. So you can go up there today, um, and rub Brighty's nose, just like several of the great National Park Service rangers and this guy on the right um, has done. Every time I go up there, I of course rub Brighty's nose because that's what you have to do for good luck. So I think this is a really fascinating story, like I said, because it combines a real history with with fictionalized story into a best-selling book, into a movie, and so you get all this, and then the impact all that had on park policy, which was a positive impact. I think it's a really great story, and I encourage you, if you want to learn more, there's a lot of places you can go. Um, One is, of course, to get the book itself, Variety of the Grand Canyon. This is available in libraries. You can get it at the South Rim, probably, I think the North Rim also. Um, a few years ago, Martha McKee, um, one of the descendants of the original McKees, she wrote this book. Bobby, Brighty, and Wiley. Bobby is the boy's name. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. Thomas was the father. Bobby was the boy. Um, but anyway, she wrote this book. You can get this at the Grand Canyon. I got this at Bright Angel Bookshop. Um, you can get the movie on DVD. It's available. I think I saw it also. I did a search for Bright of the Grand Canyon streaming, and I found it on something a couple of years ago. I can't remember what it was on. And then another great place is um, one of the great historians of Grand Canyon history, Don Lago. If you haven't read his books about the Grand Canyon, they're just fabulous. And one of those is Canyon of Dreams, and he tells the story in Canyon of Dreams. So there's a lot of places you can learn more about the story. I just think it's fabulous. Like I said, there are so many stories about the Grand Canyon, and I think it's what makes it so special for so many of us. We all have our favorite stories or aspects of the canyon. This is one of my favorites, and it's a real pleasure and honor for me to be able to share that with you. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And thanks for our team, Tom, Davey, and Karen, for making this event happen. Thanks to the rest of the Grand Canyon Historical Society board members who just do amazing work in bringing this history to light. And thanks to everybody for watching and sharing the excitement of the Grand Canyon. With that, I'll stop yapping and turn it back to Tom, who will tell me what I should
Okay,
do or
just
not do.
stop sharing, Kevin, if you'd be so kind. So we
Yep.
just
Okay.
see, there we go. Um, I'll change the gallery view to be both of us. Well, the way comments will work, everyone, is the YouTube participants can put their comments into the YouTube chat, and then those of us operating in the background here on another platform will see the comments relate to us. I did have a question, Kevin. When was the statue relocated to the North Rim? I missed that. What year was that?
It was
Do you remember offhand?
I forgot offhand.
Was it recent?
No, no, it's been like a couple decades.
Oh, okay. So it's more,
Yeah,
let's say just 20 plus years
yeah,
ago. Because I've been to that. I saw that at the lodge. I didn't know what it meant when I saw it the
yeah.
first time.
And now there's some nice displays around to tell some of the story, but
Yeah.
I think it's neat because Brighty's story goes back, 130 years, and yet it's a story that so many modern Grand Canyon people are familiar with because, like the Roses and Michaels who helped relocate it, and the Lausanne family who have been part of the
Hmm.
Grand Canyon since we've done tourism up there and mining and such. Um, People remember the different stages of where the statue was, and remember um, the different policies of the Grand Canyon. So it's a
Right.
story that has a great heritage going back to early history as well as modern history.
So just let everyone know, the first chapter of the proceedings is Robert Lauzon's generational study, which he called Romance on the Rim. It was a very good paper, which he gave at the symposium. And we are planning a follow-up set of papers about romantic romances that occurred at Grand Canyon, romances and marriages that came out of the Grand Canyon. That's a theme for a new set of web seminars.
And Tom,
Um,
I have to point out, I just noticed a comment by Beth Cook.
yeah, I was just
Thanks
going to
for
say,
watching and
you can see
says,
the
thank you. I
comments.
remember Brighty from my childhood. And I just want to clarify if Beth, if you remember the actual Brighty or maybe, the stories of Brighty, you might date yourself a little bit here.
That would be extraordinary to go back to 1922.
Yeah, right.
Uh, so you saw the comment from Carla Horn, uh, thanking you, of course, and Brady lives running and wild and free.
Yeah, and
Also, Karen,
yeah.
go ahead.
And that's I think the heritage. I mean, the ending of the real Brighty is not, it's not the way we want to remember Brighty, but it's the heritage of Brighty and the legacy is holy cow, it's inspired so many people. And I think that's a great way to remember Brighty.
And Kathy Ferretta also thanks you for the presentation. And I did have one other question about where were the feral donkeys relocated during that 80 to 81 roundup?
They took them to several different national parks
Okay,
that had and different, not just national parks, but other places that could accommodate them. I mean, and actually I misspoke, not national parks, but different parks. And it's
right.
the problem at other national parks also where the same thing, where they were taken in for mining or tourism or
Hmm.
several different reasons. And, it's just like sometimes a problem in Flagstaff, there's a certain number of feral dogs and cats where, students at the end of the year, they kind of release them.
Right.
It's sort of a similar type thing where, uh, you know, it's not very easy to take them out of there. They'll just let them run. And so that it became quite the problem, but they ended up handling it very nicely.
Well, Ed Keeble, the superintendent, has talked about the roundup of wild horses and other
Mhm.
wild animals on the North Rim, the Kaibab Plateau, because that is a continuing problem.
Yeah.
I know they've been relocating wild horses uh, west of west of the national park in open space in Arizona.
And this is an ongoing thing and, the ecology and introduced species. We
Hmm.
take boats down the river, which is great, but then we introduce species of mollusks that are on the
Hmm.
bottom of boats and stuff. So
Yes.
it's a it's an ongoing thing of how we appreciate nature, but try to minimize our impact on it.
Well, I'm just looking if there's any more comments or questions. Again, this will be of course, it was live stream, but the edited video will be available probably this weekend. It'll be on the YouTube channel as is the presentation. Um, our editor, the other famous, we had two famous Davies mentioned. We had
Mm.
Davy Crockett, of course, and we have two Davy Crockett's, the one in the movie, and then the one who's our IT and a member of the board and vice president. So we're lucky to have him on tonight to help us with the technical details. Um, so if there's no further questions, we want to thank everyone for attending. Oh, we have Kim Christensen. So Kim is also a fellow member of the Patrons Group. He's out of Iowa, and he said, Kevin, you did a great job telling the story of Brighty. Love the story." Uh, I, I I think we all share that same sentiment, and it it reminded me of another movie that came out of Grand Canyon, a Disney movie, and many of you attended the presentation by the daughter of the animator from Disney Studios who did the work um, on that production, which was dated from the 60s. It was the PAL. It was basically dedicated to the PAL expeditions, and this is now the second movie I've heard of that's devoted to Grand Canyon lore and Grand Canyon history. I'm sure there'll be many more.
And just a final note, Carla Horn, thanks for your comment.
Yep.
She believes most of the burros that were airlifted out went to Texas.
Oh, Black Ranch. Okay, that's great to know. Well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to stop the recording and end our virtual outing tonight.